The Arizona sun offered no mercy, bleaching the very memory of color from the sky. For Susanna May Dalton, alone in the vast, silent expanse of the Dalton Ranch, that sun was a constant witness to her solitude. Her father had vanished with the last rains, leaving only dust debt and the deafening quiet. But the silence was about to be broken. He appeared not with a thunder of hooves, but as a shimmer in the heat, a phantom of leather and muscle. His name was Kokum, a Chiricahua warrior, whose eyes held the hardness of the surrounding mountains. He didn't ask for water or food. He stood before her, a symbol of the raw, untamed land she was trying to conquer, and delivered a promise that was both a curse and a prophecy. Your father stole our sacred lands. You will pay his debt. You'll carry my heir before spring. The words hung in the shimmering heat between them, more solid than a mirage, more dangerous than a coiled rattler. Susanna May Dalton stood frozen on the warped porch of the home her father William had built with his own 2 hands, and then abandoned without a word. Her hand, which had been reaching for the half-empty water bucket, now hovered uselessly in the air. Her knuckles were white. I don't know what you're talking about. She finally managed her voice, a dry rasp that the thirsty air seemed to swallow whole. My father was an honest man. He bought this land from the territory government fair and square. The Apache warrior Kokum gave a low, humorless chuckle. It was a sound like stones grinding together. He was tall, leaner than the cowboys who drifted through Tucson, but corded with a strength that spoke of a life lived on the edge of survival. His face was a mask of hard planes and sharp angles, framed by straight black hair that fell past his shoulders, but it was his eyes that held her captive, dark, intelligent, and filled with a sorrow so profound it had curdled into rage. Your government's paper is meaningless here, he said, his English precise, carrying only a slight guttural accent. This valley, this creek, it is the cradle of my people. The Whispering Creek, you call it. To us it is where the spirits of our ancestors speak on the wind. Your father knew this. He was warned. Susanna's mind reeled. Warned William Dalton was a stubborn, pragmatic man who saw the world in terms of acreage and profit. He wasn't one for spirits or warnings. He'd seen the year-round creek a rarity in this part of the territory and declared it his legacy, a legacy he'd left for her to defend or die on. He's gone, she said the words, tasting like ash. He rode out 2 months ago for supplies and never came back. The debt is with him, not me. Kokum took a slow step forward, the soft soles of his moccasins making no sound on the parched earth. He stopped at the foot of the porch steps close enough that she could see the intricate beadwork on his leather vest and the faint white lines of old scars on his forearms. Debts of blood and land do not disappear with the debtor, he said, his gaze unwavering. My people are starving. The bluecoats push us further into the barren mountains while your people take the water. My wife and son died of the fever last winter because we were driven from the herbs that grow only by this creek. A life for a life, a future for a future. He gestured to the desolate landscape around them. Your world encroaches, it devours. To survive we must be strong. We must have a new generation, born with the strength of the mountain and the cunning of the coyote. His eyes locked onto hers again, and the intensity in them made her skin crawl. The shaman had a vision, a child born of 2 worlds, one of Chiricahua blood, one of the people who stole the sun from our sky. A child who can walk in both worlds, who can lead our people through the coming darkness. A son from my body and yours. It was madness. The desperate, terrifying logic of a man pushed to the very brink, This wasn't a simple threat of violence. It was a declaration of purpose, a plan so audacious and horrifying that Susanna felt a wave of dizziness wash over her. "No," she whispered, shaking her head. "Never." Her hand finally dropped instinctively, moving towards the rifle propped just inside the doorway. Kokum saw the movement. He didn't tense, didn't reach for the knife at his belt or the bow slung over his back. He simply watched her, a flicker of something was it, pity, respect in his dark eyes. "You have courage, daughter of William Dalton," he said, his voice dropping to a low, solemn tone. "It will serve you well. I will not harm you today. You are the vessel for our future, and a vessel must not be broken." He turned and walked away, not with the haste of a raider, but with the deliberate pace of a man who owned the very ground he walked on. He paused near the struggling cottonwood that gave the ranch its name and looked back at her. "The first snows will soon dust the dragoons," he called out, his voice carrying clearly in the still air. "The winter will be hard for a lone woman. But you will survive. And when the snows melt and the creek swells with new life, you will be ready." His final words were not a threat, but a statement of absolute fact, a prophecy he intended to fulfill himself. "You'll carry my heir before spring." Susanna stood, clutching the rough wood of the porch, railing, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She watched until he was once again a mere shimmer in the distance, absorbed by the vast, indifferent landscape. She was alone again, but the silence was gone. It had been replaced by the echo of his vow, a promise that would haunt her days and terrorize her nights. The sun beat down, but for the first time in her life, Susanna May Dalton felt a chill that went straight to the bone. She was no longer just a deserted rancher's daughter. She was a woman marked by fate, standing on the front line of a war she never knew she was a part of. The weeks that followed were a testament to Susanna's grit. Every sunrise she expected to see Kokum's silhouette on the ridge, a harbinger of her terrifying fate. Every sunset she barred the door and sat with her father's rifle across her lap, starting at every creak of the cabin, every hoot of an owl. But he did not come for her. Instead, a strange and unsettling pattern began. One morning she found a freshly killed doe lying by her well, its throat cut with a single clean slice. There were no tracks but her own. A week later, a bundle of dried herbs, the kind she recognized as being good for warding off sickness, appeared on her porch, tied with a strip of rawhide. Then a brace of rabbits already skinned. It was his work. She knew it as surely as she knew the shape of the mountains on the horizon. This was not kindness. It was a calculated act of preservation. He was keeping his chosen vessel strong and healthy. The thought sent a fresh wave of revulsion and fear through her, yet she couldn't deny the gnawing hunger in her belly. With a sense of profound self-loathing, she cooked the venison. She brewed the herbs into a bitter tea. She survived on the offerings of her captor in waiting. Her life became a paradox. She was a prisoner in her own home, kept alive by the very man who had promised to destroy her world. She worked relentlessly, repairing fences, tending to her small withered garden, and caring for her father's 2 remaining horses. The physical labor was a blessing. It exhausted her body and left little room for the terror that festered in the quiet moments. The outside world, however, had not forgotten her. In late October, a dust cloud on the horizon resolved itself into 2 riders. One was Sheriff Brody Kane from Tucson. He was a man whose ambition had outgrown his small town, a portly figure who sweated in his thick wool suit even in the autumn cool. The man beside him was his deputy, a lanky, quiet youth named Peterson. Miss Dalton Sheriff Kane boomed, dismounting with a grunt. He removed his hat, revealing a bald, sunburned scalp. "Just making my rounds. Wanted to check on you all alone out here. Heard your father still ain't back." "I'm managing Sheriff Susanna," said coolly, staying on her porch, the rifle never far from her hand. Kane's eyes, small and shrewd, roamed over the property. They lingered on the repaired fence line, the neatly stacked firewood, the relative health of her horses. He seemed disappointed. "Managing is one thing, flourishing is another," he said, his tone slick with false concern. "This is no place for a woman on her own. There's Apache renegades about. Kochis' band may have surrendered, but there's still wild ones in them hills. Like that dog Kokum. Caused no end of trouble." At the mention of the name, Susanna's blood ran cold. She forced her expression to remain neutral. "I'm well armed, Sheriff. I can take care of myself." Perhaps Kane conceded, stepping closer. He lowered his voice. "But think of the future, Susanna. Your father owed a considerable sum to Mr. Henderson at the bank in Tucson. A property tax bill is coming due. Without a man to work this ranch, the bank will have no choice but to foreclose." He paused, letting the words sink in. "Now I happen to have a business acquaintance who is very interested in acquiring land with good water rights. He'd be willing to pay off your father's debt, leave you with a little something for your trouble, enough to get you a nice, safe life back in town." The pieces clicked into place. Kane wasn't here out of concern. He was a vulture, circling what he believed was a dying animal. He wanted her land, the precious water of Whispering Creek. "The ranch is not for sale, Sheriff," she said, her voice hard as iron. "I'll find a way to pay the taxes." Kane's friendly demeanor vanished, replaced by a sneer. "Don't be a fool, girl. You're sitting on a gold mine you can't dig. You'll be starved out or carried off by savages before the winter's through. My offer is your only way out." "I'll take my chances," she retorted. He stared at her for a long moment, his little eyes glinting with malice. "Have it your way," he finally said, turning to remount his horse. "But when you're screaming for help in the dead of night, don't expect us to come running. You made your bed." As he and his deputy rode away, Susanna felt a new kind of fear, one that was colder and more insidious than what Kokum inspired. The Apache warrior saw her as a means to an end, a part of a mystical, desperate plan. Sheriff Kane saw her as nothing more than an obstacle, a piece of property to be cleared away. She was trapped. On one side were the savages in the mountains, represented by one man with a terrifyingly specific intention for her. On the other side were the civilized men from town who would use laws and debts to strip her of everything she had and leave her with nothing. That night, a fierce wind howled down from the mountains, rattling the cabin's lone window. It sounded like the whispers of ghosts, or perhaps the spirits of the Chiricahua. Susanna sat by her small fire, the rifle in her lap, and stared into the flames. Kokum had promised she would survive the winter. Sheriff Kane had predicted she wouldn't. In a world where she had no allies, she was forced to wonder which man's prophecy she feared more. For the first time, the food Kokum left for her felt less like a threat and more like a fragile, unspoken truce in a war being fought on two fronts. The first real cold snap of winter arrived with a vengeance, icing the edges of the creek and turning the morning ground as hard as stone. Susanna was out checking the snares she'd set for rabbits, a skill her father had begrudgingly taught her when her world tilted on its axis. She was kneeling to inspect a promising spot beneath a thicket of mesquite, her focus entirely on the task at hand. She never heard the dry, papery rattle until it was too late. A searing pain, white-hot and immediate, shot through her calf. She cried out, stumbling backward, her eyes wide with horror, as she saw the diamond-patterned snake slithering away into the underbrush. A western diamondback, big, angry. Panic seized her, cold and absolute. She knew what a bite like this meant out here, miles from any doctor. It was a death sentence, slow and agonizing. Her father's words echoed in her memory. Could it suck the poison out? But the bite was on the back of her calf, an impossible angle to reach. Gritting her teeth against the waves of pain and nausea already starting to crest, she tore a strip from her petticoat and tied a desperate tourniquet above her knee. She had to get back to the cabin. She had to try. Leaning heavily on her rifle as a crutch, she began to hobble each step, an explosion of agony. The world began to swim the sharp outlines of the landscape, blurring into a watercolor wash of browns and pale blues. She made it less than 50 yards before her leg gave out completely. She collapsed in a heap, the dust rising around her. The sky seemed to spin the sun a blinding, mocking eye. This was it then. Not the Apache warrior, not the greedy sheriff, but a simple snake, an indifferent agent of the wild would be her end. Her last conscious thought was one of bitter irony. She awoke to a different reality. The world was soft and dark, the air thick with the smell of wood smoke, unfamiliar herbs and tanned leather. She wasn't on the hard, dusty ground. She was lying on a bed of soft furs, a rough spun blanket covering her. A low fire crackled nearby, casting flickering shadows against a curved surface she vaguely recognized as the hide walls of a wickiup. A figure moved in the firelight. Kokum. He was kneeling beside her, his expression unreadable. He held a small stone bowl. He'd cut away the fabric of her pant leg, and she could see her calf, swollen and discolored, but cleaned and packed with a dark, wet poultice of crushed leaves. The poison was strong, he said, his voice a low rumble. You were close to the spirit world. Susanna tried to speak, but her throat was parched, her lips cracked. He seemed to understand, holding a water skin to her lips. She drank greedily. The water was cool and clean. How she managed to whisper. I follow you, he said, simply, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. To make sure the vessel is safe. The word still sent a shiver of dread through her, but the fear was blunted by a powerful wave of exhaustion and a strange, disorienting sense of gratitude. He had saved her life. The man who was her greatest threat had become her sole protector. He gently removed the old poultice and began applying a fresh one. His hands were surprisingly gentle, his movements deft and certain. He worked with the focused intensity of a healer, a stark contrast to the fierce warrior who had confronted her on her porch. She watched him, her mind, a confusing jumble of fear and relief. Why, she asked again, her voice a little stronger. Why not just let me die? It would have been easier for you. He paused, his dark eyes meeting hers in the flickering light. For the first time, she saw past the warrior's mask to the man beneath. She saw a weariness that seemed carved into his bones, a profound sadness that the firelight could not soften. It is not my way to let life be wasted, he said slowly. And your life, it is tied to the fate of my people now. Your death would mean nothing. Your life and the life you will carry. It is our only hope. He finished tending to her leg and sat back on his heels. He offered her the stone bowl. It contained a thin, warm broth that smelled of corn and meat. Her stomach growled in betrayal of her fear. She took the bowl, her hand trembling slightly, and began to eat. For 3 days she drifted in and out of a feverish haze. Kokum was a constant silent presence. He tended the fire, changed the poultice on her leg, and forced her to drink water and broth. He spoke little, but his actions spoke volumes. He was patient. He was methodical. He was keeping her alive. During her lucid moments, she observed her surroundings. The wickiup was small but ingeniously constructed. Tools of stone and bone lay neatly arranged. There was a stark Spartan efficiency to it all. This was not the camp of a large war party, but a secluded, hidden place. He was alone, too. On the fourth day, the fever broke. She woke up feeling weak but clear-headed, the terrible throbbing in her leg reduced to a dull ache. Kokum was outside, and for the first time, Susanna was able to push herself into a sitting position. The world didn't spin. She looked at her leg. The swelling had gone down significantly. The skin around the fang marks was still a bruised purple, but it was clean and healing. He had known exactly what to do. He entered the wickiup, then carrying fresh water. He stopped when he saw her sitting up. Their eyes met, and in that moment, the dynamic between them shifted irrevocably. She was no longer just his quarry, the object of his prophecy. She was a life he had personally, painstakingly pulled back from the brink, and he was no longer just the savage who had threatened her. He was the man who had saved her. The serpent in the valley had failed to kill her, but it had succeeded in binding their fates together in a way neither of them could have ever predicted. Kokum's camp was not a camp at all, but a small, hidden settlement nestled in a high canyon of the Dragoon Mountains. When Susanna was finally strong enough to walk with the aid of a crude crutch, he led her there. It was a journey of a few miles, up winding, secret paths that would be invisible to any pursuing posse. The settlement was a shock. She had expected a bustling war camp filled with fierce, painted warriors. Instead, she found a ghost of a tribe. There were perhaps 24 people in total, mostly women, children and old men. The few warriors present were young boys or men past their prime, their faces etched with hunger and worry. They were the remnants of a band, the survivors of battles and disease, clinging to existence in the high cold rocks. Her arrival caused a stir. Faces peered at her from the entrances of the wickiups, a mixture of fear, hatred, and raw curiosity. A white woman brought into their sacred refuge by their strongest warrior. An old woman with a face like a wrinkled map and eyes as sharp and black as obsidian chips emerged from the largest wickiup. Her name, Susanna would learn, was Narlin. She was the shaman's widow and the keeper of the band's history. She approached Kokum, her gaze fixed on Susanna, and spoke to him in the rapid, guttural tongue of the Apache. Her tone was sharp, questioning. Kokum answered in a calm, steady voice. He gestured to Susanna, then to the sky, then to the ground, and though she couldn't understand the words, she understood the weight of them. He was explaining himself, justifying his actions. He was telling them about the prophecy. Narlin's sharp eyes then turned to Susanna, scrutinizing her from head to toe. She walked a slow circle around her, her gaze lingering on Susanna's fair hair and blue eyes. She grunted a sound of profound skepticism, but did not challenge Kokum further. She simply turned and disappeared back into her wickiup. A young warrior named Taza, his face a mask of youthful rage, spat on the ground near Susanna's feet before Kokum's sharp command sent him stalking away. The welcome was clear. She was an unwelcome spectre, a contamination in their sanctuary. The days that followed were an education in survival and sorrow. Susanna saw firsthand the truth of Kokum's words. They were starving. The hunters returned with little a few squirrels, a scrawny bird. The children were listless, their bellies swollen. The bluecoats had driven them from their traditional wintering grounds in the fertile valleys, forcing them into this barren fortress of rock, where little grew and game was scarce. Kokum didn't treat her as a prisoner. She was given a small wickiup of her own and a share of their meager food. But she was watched, always. He began to teach her not as a captor to a captive, but as a mentor to a student. He showed her which roots were edible, how to make cordage from yucca fibers, how to read the clouds for signs of a coming storm. One evening, as they sat by a shared fire, he finally spoke of the vision that drove him. Our shaman, before he died, sought a vision to save us. Kokum began his voice, low his eyes on the dancing flames. He starved himself for 3 days and 3 nights on the highest peak. The spirits showed him the end of our world. They showed him the iron horse screaming across our lands, the buffalo gone, the Chiricahua people living in cages, fed like dogs by the white men. He paused, the muscle in his jaw tight. But they gave him one thread of hope. They showed him a child, a boy with my blood in his veins, but with eyes the color of the sky. A child who could speak the white man's tongue and know his ways, but who had the heart of an Apache. This child, they said, would not be a great warrior with a bow, but with words. He would speak to your leaders, your chiefs in Washington. He would make them see us not as ghosts or savages, but as a people of this land. He would win back a piece of what was stolen, a place for us to live, not as prisoners, but as Chiricahua. Susanna listened, her heart aching with a strange mix of pity and disbelief. It was a beautiful, desperate dream, born of utter hopelessness. And you believe that we... She couldn't finish the sentence. It is not what I want, he said, looking at her directly. The vulnerability in his eyes was startling. My wife. She was the sun in my sky. My sun. He was my heart. They are gone. My heart is stone now. This is not about desire, Susanna May. It is about duty. It is the only path I see that does not end with my people being erased from the earth. She began to understand. The vow he had made on her porch was not born of cruelty or lust. It was an act of profound, agonizing sacrifice. He was willing to bind himself to a woman from his enemies, to create a child who would be part of a world that had destroyed his own, all for the slimmest chance of survival for his people. Her perception of him fractured and reformed. The savage warrior was gone, replaced by a leader carrying an impossible burden. A grieving husband and father. A man clinging to a desperate prophecy as his world crumbled around him. She started to help where she could. She used the mending skills her mother had taught her to repair the children's worn clothing with an old needle and thread she'd had in her pocket. She showed the women how to make a more nourishing stew from the tough roots they gathered, boiling them for hours until they were soft. Nalin watched her every move, her expression unchanging. But one afternoon, as Susanna was helping a young mother soothe a crying baby, the old woman approached. She held out a small, intricately beaded pouch. For healing, Nalin said in broken, halting English. It was the first time she had spoken directly to Susanna. It was a small gesture, but it felt monumental. It was not acceptance, not yet. But it was a crack in the wall of hostility. Taza and the other young warriors still looked at her with hatred, but the women and children began to see her, not as the white-eyed enemy, but as a person. Living among them, sharing their hunger and their fears. Susanna's own world expanded. The conflict was no longer a simple one of a lone woman against a savage threat. It was a complex tapestry of survival history and a desperate, heartbreaking hope for the future. And she somehow had become the central thread. The mystery of her father, William Dalton, had been a dull ache in the back of Susanna's mind, a question mark hanging over her entire existence. In the Apache camp, that question mark began to sharpen into a painful, complex story. It happened on a cold, clear afternoon. Nalin, the old matriarch, had summoned Susanna to her wickiup. The air inside was thick with the scent of sage, and something older, more sacred. The old woman was sorting through a parfleche bag, her gnarled fingers, handling the contents with reverence. They were artifacts remnants of a bygone era, a US cavalry button, a string of glass beads, a child's worn moccasin. From the very bottom of the bag, she pulled out a small object and held it out to Susanna. It was a whittling of a bird, a hawk in mid-flight carved from cottonwood. The style was unmistakable. The tiny, precise knife strokes the way the grain of the wood was used to simulate feathers. Susanna would know it anywhere. Her breath hitched. "This was my father's," she whispered, her fingers tracing the familiar lines. "He was always carving. He made one just like this for my mother." Nalin nodded slowly. "He gave this to my husband many winters ago. He was a different man then. We called him Man Who Builds with Wood." Susanna sank to the furs beside the old woman, her mind reeling. "You knew him, my father. He came to this land long before the ranch house stood." Nalin began her voice, a low, raspy chant, as if reciting an old story. "He was a trapper then, alone. He was not like the others. He did not see us as animals. He saw the creek and he knew it was sacred to us. He did not defile it. He traded with us, blankets and knives for furs. He learned some of our words. My husband, the shaman, considered him a friend. The image was so contrary to the tight-lipped, possessive man, she knew that Susanna could barely comprehend it. A friend to the Chiricahua. He even sat at our fires. Nalin continued, her dark eyes distant. He spoke of a wife he had lost, a daughter he was raising. He said this land held the spirit of his wife. He respected the spirits then. "What happened?" Susanna asked, her voice barely audible. "What changed him?" Nalin's face hardened. Gold, she spat the word like a poison. Prospectors came whispering in his ear. They spoke of the yellow metal in the hills. And then men from the government came. They brought papers. They told him the land could be his. All of it. The creek, the valley, the foothills. His if he signed their paper and built a permanent dwelling. The story began to align with her own memories. Her father's sudden obsession with legal deeds. His frantic work building the ranch house. His growing paranoia and hostility towards anyone who came near his property line. "My husband warned him," Nalin said, her voice laced with old sorrow. "He told him that to own the land was to cage a spirit, and it would poison his soul. Your father did not listen. The friend we knew vanished. In his place was a man with fences in his eyes, a man who saw us not as people, but as threats to his paper claim. He drove us away from the creek, the water of our ancestors, the place where our healing herbs grow." She looked directly at Susanna. "That is the debt Kokum speaks of. Not just the land, but the betrayal. A betrayal that helped to kill his wife and son when they fell sick, and we could not reach the medicines that grow only on the land your father stole. The truth was a physical blow. Her father hadn't been an innocent rancher carving out a life. He had been a friend who became a traitor, a man who chose paper and property over people and honor. The foundation of her entire life, her belief in her father's simple, rugged honesty, crumbled into dust. She was the daughter of a thief and a promise breaker. Later that day, seeking solitude, Susanna found Kokum standing on a high ledge overlooking the vast expanse of the territory. He was staring eastward, toward the distant hazy spot where her ranch lay. Nalin told me, she said, her voice quiet. He did not turn. "She is the memory of our people." "I'm sorry," she said the words, feeling pitifully inadequate. "I never knew. He was not always a bad man, Kokum said, his voice, surprisingly devoid of anger, filled only with a deep, echoing weariness. I remember him as a boy. He showed me how to set a snare, the white man's way, with wire. He laughed when I caught a rabbit. He finally turned to look at her, and his eyes were filled with a complex pain. This land changes people. For some it makes them hard and true, like the mountain stone. For others it fills their heart with a greed that cracks them open, leaving them hollow. In that moment, Susanna understood the true weight of the prophecy. It wasn't just about creating a child to be a political leader. It was about healing a wound that was generations deep. It was about mending a betrayal that had begun with her own father. The heir he spoke of was not just a son. It was a chance at redemption, a bridge back to a time when two different peoples could share a fire and a laugh beside a sacred creek. The knowledge settled heavily in her soul. She was not just a vessel for the future of his people. She was the living legacy of her father's sin, and her fate was to be the instrument of its atonement. The choice was no longer about survival or defiance. It was about honor, and a debt she now understood she was morally bound to repay. The first heavy snow of winter came early, blanketing the mountains in a thick layer of white and effectively sealing the Chiricahua in their canyon sanctuary. The world grew quiet, and a strange domestic rhythm took hold. Susanna became a part of the camp's life, her presence less of an intrusion and more of a quiet fact. She learned to grind mesquite beans into flour, to patch moccasins with an awl and sinew, and to sit in silence, a skill she was beginning to appreciate. Her relationship with Kokum remained one of respectful distance. The vow hung between them, unspoken, but ever-present. Yet it had transformed. It was no longer a threat looming over her head, but a shared, solemn future they were both cautiously walking towards. She saw the way he looked at the children of the tribe with a fatherly tenderness that was heartbreakingly at odds with his fierce reputation. She saw the burden of leadership he carried, the responsibility for every hungry belly, every weary soul. The fragile peace was shattered by Taza, the angry young warrior. He and two others had defied Kokum's orders and slipped out of the canyon, desperate to hunt in the lower elevations. They returned not with meat, but with news that was far more dangerous. Apache Taza announced his chest heaving as he stood before Kokum and the rest of the small band. Led by the white chief from Tucson, the one they call Cain. They are at the Dalton Ranch. They say the Apache have taken the white woman, and they are gathering men to come into the mountains to bring justice. A cold dread washed over Susanna. Brody Cain. He wasn't seeking justice. He was manufacturing an excuse. He was using her supposed kidnapping as the pretext to do what he'd wanted all along, to drive the Apache from the hills and seize the land, all of it, for his own greedy purposes. He will use this to bring the soldiers, Kokum said, his voice grim. He will lead them to this canyon. He will slaughter us all. Panic rippled through the small camp. This was the end they had always feared. No, Susanna said, stepping forward, her voice ringing with a newfound authority. He won't. Because I'm going back. Every eye turned to her. Kokum stared, his expression a mixture of shock and disbelief. If I'm at the ranch, she explained, her mind racing, then there is no kidnapping. There's no excuse for a posse, no reason for the soldiers to come. I can tell them I was lost and you helped me. They will not believe you, Taza sneered. They will see you as a traitor. It doesn't matter if they believe me, she shot back. It only matters that I am there alive and unharmed. It takes away Cain's reason. He would be a laughing stock raising a posse to rescue a woman who doesn't need rescuing. Kokum considered her words, his dark eyes searching her face. He saw not a frightened captive, but a determined woman fighting for a cause that had become her own. He saw the strength he had first recognized on her porch, now forged into something new. "It is too dangerous," he said. "Cain will not simply give up. He will try to harm you to prove his point." "Then you'll have to come with me," she said, looking him straight in the eye. "Not all of you. That would look like an invasion. Just you. We'll get there before they move out. We'll face them together." It was a mad plan, a gamble with impossible odds, but it was the only plan they had. The journey back down the mountain was treacherous, a desperate scramble through snow-choked passes and icy slopes. They moved with a speed born of necessity, Susanna's previous weeks of mountain living having hardened her body and spirit. They arrived at the ridge overlooking Whispering Creek just as dawn was breaking. The sight below stole her breath. Her small ranch house was transformed into an armed camp. At least 15 men, a rough-looking posse, armed with rifles and pistols, were milling about, drinking coffee and preparing their horses. Sheriff Cain was at the center of it all, gesturing grandly towards the mountains. "They are preparing to ride, Kokum," whispered his hand, resting on the hilt of his knife. "Then we don't have time to wait," Susanna said. "We have to stop them now." Ignoring Kokum's hiss to wait, Susanna stood up from behind the rocks, her figure silhouetted against the rising sun. "Sheriff Cain!" she yelled, her voice echoing in the cold morning air. Down below, all activity ceased. 15 heads swiveled and stared up at the ridge. A collective gasp went through the men. Sheriff Cain's jaw dropped. "Miss Dalton," he sputtered, his face a mask of confusion. "Call off your men, Sheriff," she shouted. "There's been no kidnapping. I'm fine." Cain's confusion quickly morphed into fury. His entire pretext was literally standing on a hill, dismantling his scheme. "She's been bewitched. It's an Apache trick," he roared to his men. "They're up there with her. Get her." Several of the men caught up in Cain's fervor raised their rifles. At that moment, Kokum rose to stand beside Susanna. An arrow was nocked in his bow, its flint head glinting in the sun. The sight of the infamous warrior beside the kidnapped woman sent a wave of confusion through the posse. This wasn't what they had been told. "This is a private matter, gentlemen," Susanna yelled down. "Sheriff Cain is trying to use you to steal my land. He lied to all of you, lies." Cain shrieked, his face turning purple. He raised his own pistol and fired a wild shot towards the ridge. It whizzed past Susanna's head. That was all it took. The first shot started a war. Kokum loosed his arrow, which buried itself in the shoulder of the man nearest to Cain. Susanna, her heart pounding, pulled Kokum back behind the cover of the rocks as a volley of rifle fire kicked up dust and splintered stone around them. The siege of Whispering Creek had begun. It was not a battle of armies, but a desperate fight of 2 people against 15. Kokum was a master of rock and shadow, his bow a silent, deadly weapon. He moved from position to position, loosing arrows with deadly accuracy, making their small force seem larger than it was. Susanna, armed with her father's rifle, became his eyes. She knew this land, every dip and gully. She called out positions, reloaded the rifle with steady hands, and fired sparingly, aiming not to kill, but to pin the men down. They fought side by side, a seamless unit, born of necessity and a shared purpose. The civilized man in the valley below had become the savage driven by greed, and the so-called savage in the rocks above was fighting to protect a home, a woman, and a future. The irony was as sharp as the cold winter air. The battle for Whispering Creek would determine not just who controlled a piece of land, but which world and which future would survive. The siege lasted for 2 brutal, sun-drenched hours. The posse, initially confident in their superior numbers, grew frustrated and fearful. Kokum was a ghost in the rocks, his arrows seeming to come from everywhere at once. Susanna's rifle shots were precise, kicking up dirt near any man who tried to advance, forcing them to stay behind the poor cover of the corral and water trough. Doubt began to fester among the men. This wasn't the righteous rescue mission they'd signed up for. It was an ambush, and the woman they were supposed to be saving was firing at them. The breaking point came when Deputy Peterson, the young man who had accompanied Kane on his first visit, took a non-fatal arrow to his thigh. His cry of pain and shock seemed to break the spell of Kane's authority. "This is a fool's errand," one of the men yelled from behind a wagon. "She's with him. This ain't our fight. Cowards!" Kane roared, his face slick with sweat despite the cold. "I'll pay double to the man who brings me that Apache's scalp." But his promises of blood money were no longer enough. The men began to mount their horses in a disorganized retreat, dragging the wounded deputy with them. They wanted no more part of Brody Kane's land grab. Kane, seeing his power and his plan dissolving into the dust, was consumed by a blind rage. He stood alone, abandoned by his own men, and raised his pistol for one last desperate act of vengeance. He aimed not at the rocks where Kokum hid, but directly at Susanna as she peered out to track the posse's retreat. "If I can't have the land," he screamed, his voice cracking, "then no one will." Kokum moved faster than she thought possible. He launched himself from the rocks, crossing the open ground between them in a blur of motion. He didn't use his bow or knife. He hit Kane with the full force of his body, a primal collision of muscle and bone. The pistol fired the shot, going wild into the sky. The two men fell to the ground in a desperate, violent struggle. Susanna scrambled down the rocks, her rifle ready, but it was over in seconds. Kokum, fueled by a righteous fury, was stronger and faster. He disarmed Kane, his knife finally appearing in his hand, its edge pressed against the terrified sheriff's throat. For a long moment, silence reigned. The retreating posse was a dust cloud in the distance. The creek whispered its eternal song. Kokum's chest heaved, his eyes burning with a fire that could have ended Kane's life right there. But then he looked up and saw Susanna. He saw her home, the smoke curling from the chimney. He saw the future he was fighting for. With a grunt, he pulled the knife away and hauled the sputtering sheriff to his feet. "Get out, Kokum," growled his voice low and dangerous, "and tell your people what happened here. Tell them the spirits of this valley are not to be trifled with. Go." He shoved Kane toward his horse. The disgraced sheriff, stripped of his authority and his dignity, scrambled into the saddle and galloped away without a backward glance. Susanna and Kokum were left standing in the quiet aftermath, the ground littered with spent cartridges and the evidence of their desperate fight. They were bruised, exhausted, but they were alive, and they were victorious. They walked back to the small ranch house side by side. The place was hers, but it was his victory that had secured it. Inside the fire she had banked, that morning still had glowing embers. The air was still filled with an unspoken tension. The battle was over, but the question of their future remained. He turned to her, his face serious in the dim light. "You are safe now," he said. "Kane will be disgraced. No one will bother you." He was giving her an out. He was releasing her from the vow. Susanna looked around the small cabin her father had built through betrayal. She looked out the window at the creek he had stolen. And she looked at Kokum, the man who had threatened her, saved her, taught her, and fought beside her. The man who carried the entire future of his people on his shoulders. "And what of your people?" she asked softly. What of the prophecy? A shadow of pain crossed his face. "A vision is just a dream. I cannot force it to be so. You have repaid your father's debt. You are free." The first rays of the late winter sun were beginning to melt the snow on the higher peaks. The sound of dripping water, the first sign of the coming thaw, could be heard outside. Spring was near. Susanna took a step closer to him. She reached out and gently touched the back of his hand. His skin was warm. It was the first time she had ever willingly touched him. "A debt is not the only thing that binds people, Kokum," she said, her voice steady and clear. "Duty can bind them, and so can hope." She looked into his dark, weary eyes. "Your vision. It spoke of a child who could walk in two worlds. Perhaps it meant a child who is not forced but is welcomed. A child born not of a vow, but of a choice." Understanding slow and profound dawned in his eyes. The warrior's mask fell away, completely revealing the man beneath vulnerable and filled with a hope he had not dared to feel. He did not speak. He simply covered her hand with his own. They stood together in the quiet cabin, the promise of spring whispering through the valley. The air he had sworn she would carry was no longer a symbol of debt or conquest. It had become a possibility, a fragile seed of a new beginning for two people and two worlds on the banks of a sacred creek. The future was unwritten, but for the first time, it was a future they would write together. And so the story of Susanna May Dalton and the Apache warrior Kokum doesn't end with a clash of worlds, but with the quiet promise of building a new one. Their journey, which began with a terrifying vow, born from desperation and grief, transformed into a powerful tale of survival, mutual respect, and the mending of a fractured history. It reminds us that behind the labels of savage and settler are human beings driven by love loss and the fierce desire to protect their own. Their story is a testament to the idea that true strength isn't found in conquest, but in the courage to understand, to forgive, and to forge a future together against impossible odds. If this journey into the heart of the Old West moved you, please show your support by hitting that like button. Share this story with someone who loves epic tales of drama and redemption. And most importantly, subscribe to the channel and ring the notification bell so you won't miss our next story from the untamed frontier. Thank you for listening.